Hashtag first contact gone wrong. The gleaming streets of New Haven Colony buzzed with the usual mix of hover traffic and anti-grav vehicles, their metallic surfaces reflecting the purple light of the binary stars overhead. Officer Kex adjusted his regulation enforcement uniform and checked his species scanner for the 100th time that day. After 15 years on the force, he had developed what he considered a perfect sense for troublemakers, especially the newer species joining the Galactic Alliance. His antenna twitched as his scanner picked up an unusual reading. A ground car, an actual wheeled vehicle, cruised down the main thoroughfare, clearly out of place among the more advanced vehicles. Behind the wheel sat a human female, her pale skin and dark hair marking her as one of those newcomers from that backwater planet Earth. "Control, I'm investigating a suspicious vehicle," Kex reported into his comm unit. "Appears to be human-operated, probably illegal modifications." He didn't wait for a response before activating his pursuit lights. The ground car pulled over immediately, showing proper compliance with local regulations. This almost disappointed Kex. He'd hoped for some resistance to justify stronger measures. As he approached the vehicle, he made sure his body camera was malfunctioning, a trick he'd learned years ago. The human woman rolled down her window, maintaining a calm demeanor that Kex found irritating. Most species showed proper fear when confronted by a regulatory enforcement officer. "Documents and species registration," Kex demanded, his metallic voice harsh through his translator. "Of course, officer," the woman replied, reaching slowly for her bag. Her name was Jane Miller, according to her credentials, which she presented along with her newly issued Galactic Alliance citizenship card. Kex made a show of examining the documents, though he already decided the outcome of this stop. "These appear to be forgeries," he declared, despite their obvious authenticity. "Step out of the vehicle." "Officer," Jane responded evenly, "these documents were issued directly by the Galactic Alliance Embassy on Earth. If you scanned them—" "Humans are known for their deceptive practices," Kex interrupted. "Your kind hasn't evolved beyond basic tribal conflicts. You don't belong in civilized space." His antenna quivered with barely contained prejudice. Jane took a deep breath, her hands remaining visible on the steering wheel. "Officer Kex, I understand you're doing your job, but I must inform you that unfounded species-based accusations are a violation of Alliance Code 7249B. This knowledge of regulations only infuriated Kex further. How dare this primitive creature quote laws to him? He'd been enforcing order since before her species had achieved basic spaceflight. "Exit the vehicle immediately," he ordered, his hand moving to his neural stunner. "Resistance to a legal order will result in immediate detention." Around them, other vehicles slowed to observe the confrontation. Some of the newer models automatically began recording any law enforcement interactions, a feature Kex had fought against when it was implemented. Jane maintained her composure, though her heart rate increased slightly, a fact Kex's scanner gleefully reported. "Officer, I am complying with all regulations. If you believe my documents are false, please call for verification from Central Processing." "Central Processing is unnecessary," Kex sneered. "I can smell primitive deception. Your kind thinks you can just walk into our civilized society and demand equal treatment. You're barely beyond using combustion engines." As he reached for the door handle, intending to forcefully remove her from the vehicle, his comm unit crackled to life. "Officer Kex, remain in position. Superior officers are en route to your location." Kex smiled, his metallic features reflecting the starlight. "Hear that, human? Soon you'll learn how we deal with your kind in proper civilization." What Officer Kex didn't realize as he stood there radiating smoke superiority was that he had just made the biggest mistake of his career. The cards were already in motion, and his carefully maintained system of prejudice was about to come crashing down around his metallic ears. "I'll wait right here, officer," Jane replied calmly, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "I'm sure this will all be sorted out very soon." Officer Kex paced around Jane's ground car, his metal feet clicking against the pavement in a steady rhythm. Each passing minute made him more annoyed. The human woman hadn't moved, hadn't shown any sign of fear or worry. This wasn't how these stops usually went. Other enforcement officers had gathered nearby, their hovercrafts creating a loose circle around the scene. The growing crowd of onlookers made Kex's antenna twitch nervously. Most scattered when he glared at them, but a few brave souls stood their ground, their personal devices likely recording everything. "Last warning," Kex announced, leaning close to Jane's window. "Exit the vehicle voluntarily, or we'll be forced to remove you." His translator crackled with static, matching his rising anger. Jane adjusted her rearview mirror calmly. "Officer, I've already contacted the Galactic Embassy. They're sending a representative. It should only take a few more minutes." Kex's metallic features twisted into what passed for a smile among his species. "The embassy? You think they care about one human causing trouble in my sector?" He turned to his fellow officers. "Prepare for extraction. This primitive is resisting arrest." Two junior officers stepped forward, their neural stunners humming to life. The crowd grew larger, and Kex noticed several non-human species among them showing signs of disapproval. He'd deal with them later. "Officer Kex," Jane spoke again, her voice carrying across the now quiet street. "Could you please state the specific violation you're charging me with?" For the record. The question caught him off guard. Most suspects didn't know their rights, let alone ask such specific questions. "Driving an unauthorized vehicle type," he began, antenna twitching. "Possession of forged documents, resisting a legal stop." "Interesting." Jane tapped her fingers on the steering wheel. "Because according to the New Haven Colony Transport Agreement of last month, Earth-type ground cars were specifically authorized for human residents. Would you like to see the regulation?" Kex's anger flared. This human was making him look foolish in front of his officers. Documents can be forged. Laws can be misinterpreted. The simple fact is, your kind doesn't belong here. You're too primitive, too violent. Look at your planet's history. A sleek diplomatic shuttle chose that moment to descend from the upper traffic lanes, its blue and gold markings identifying it as an official Alliance vehicle. Kex felt his confidence waver slightly but pushed the feeling aside. No matter who stepped out of that shuttle, he would maintain control of this situation. "Shall we wait for them?" Jane asked pleasantly, as if they were discussing the weather. "I believe they'll have something interesting to share about those forged documents you mentioned." Kex's scanner picked up elevated stress levels from his fellow officers. They were getting nervous, probably wondering why a simple traffic stop had attracted diplomatic attention. He needed to act fast, establish dominance before things got out of hand. "Officers, remove the suspect," he ordered sharply. "Now." The junior officers hesitated, their antenna drooping with uncertainty. The diplomatic shuttle had landed, its doors beginning to open. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," Jane said softly, still maddeningly calm. "It might make things worse for your career." Kex reached for the door handle himself, determined to end this embarrassing situation. His fingers had barely touched the metal when a booming voice cut through the tense atmosphere. "Stand down, OFFICOKEX." The crowd parted as a tall human male in an immaculate Alliance security uniform strode forward, his face set in a stern expression. Behind him, a team of internal affairs investigators poured out of the shuttle, their scanners already documenting the scene. Kex's antenna went rigid with shock. He knew that uniform, knew the authority it carried. His perfect record, his carefully maintained system of keeping undesirables in their place, everything was about to change. And through it all, Jane Miller sat in her ground car, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth, watching justice unfold exactly as planned. The human male's footsteps echoed with authority as he approached Officer Kex. His Alliance security uniform gleamed under the purple light of the binary stars, gold rank insignias marking him as someone far above a local enforcer's pay grade. The crowd of onlookers had fallen completely silent. Director Miller, one of the internal affairs investigators, announced formally, "We've already begun collecting evidence from the scene." Kex's antenna drooped as the implications hit him. Miller. The same last name as the human female he'd been harassing. His scanner was going crazy with readings from his own elevated stress levels. "Good afternoon, Officer Kex," Director Tom Miller said, his voice perfectly controlled. "I see you've met my wife, Jane." He gestured toward the ground car. "I trust you've been treating her with all the respect due to a Galactic Alliance citizen." Jane finally stepped out of her vehicle, straightening her jacket with practiced ease. "Hello, dear." Officer Kex here was just explaining how my documents must be forgeries and how humans are too primitive for civilized space. Tom's expression hardened. Is that so? He turned to the internal affairs team. Please tell me you got all that on record. Every word, Director, one of them confirmed, holding up a data pad. Along with records of similar stops Officer Kex has conducted over the past 3 months. The pattern is quite clear. Kex's metallic legs felt weak. Sir, I can explain. Save it for the official hearing, Tom cut him off. For the past 6 months, the Alliance Security Bureau has been investigating reports of systematic discrimination against newly admitted species in this sector, particularly humans. He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. You've just given us exactly what we needed. The other enforcement officers had begun backing away from Kex, trying to distance themselves from what was clearly about to become a career-ending situation. The crowd had grown even larger, with news drones now hovering overhead. This is a misunderstanding, Kex tried again, his translator glitching with stress. I was simply following standard procedures for suspicious vehicles. Suspicious. Jane stepped forward, standing beside her husband. A legally registered vehicle, driven by a fully documented Alliance citizen, or was it suspicious because I'm human? Tom held up a small device. We've been monitoring your communications, officer. Your body camera didn't malfunction today. It was working perfectly, sending everything to our servers. Would you like to hear some of your previous comments about humans and several other species? Kex's antenna went completely flat against his head. That's illegal surveillance. Actually, one of the internal affairs investigators chimed in. It was authorized by the Galactic High Court as part of an ongoing investigation into civil rights violations. All perfectly legal. The crowd had begun murmuring, and Kex could hear snippets of conversation about other incidents, other stops, other examples of bias. Some were even stepping forward, wanting to share their own experiences. Here's what's going to happen, Tom announced, his voice carrying to the gathered crowd. Officer Kex, you are suspended pending a full investigation. Your fellow officers will be interviewed about their knowledge of your activities, and this entire sector's enforcement protocols will be thoroughly reviewed. Jane walked over to Kex, who now stood alone in a widening circle as everyone backed away from him. You know what the funny thing is, officer? If you'd simply treated me like any other citizen, checked my documents properly, and done your job without bias, none of this would be happening. But humans are, Kex started. Humans, Tom interrupted, are full members of the Galactic Alliance. We've earned our place here, just like every other species, and more importantly, we've learned from our own history of bias and discrimination. That's why I was chosen to head this investigation. As Kex was led away by the internal affairs team, he finally understood his mistake. He'd been so focused on his prejudices, so certain of his superiority, that he'd never considered the humans might be more advanced than he'd assumed, not in technology, but in justice. #The Fallout. News of Officer Kex's arrest spread through New Haven Colony faster than a quantum transmission. Within hours, the streets around the enforcement headquarters were filled with beings of all species, many coming forward with their own stories of discrimination. Inside the building, Tom Miller sat at Kex's former desk, reviewing files on a holographic display. The evidence was worse than they'd expected. Hundreds of illegal stops, falsified reports, and discriminatory actions, all hidden behind carefully worded official documents. Sir, a young human investigator called from across the room, you need to see this. She held up a data crystal, her hand shaking slightly. We found Officer Kex's private communication logs. He wasn't working alone. Tom's face darkened as he inserted the crystal into his reader. Names, dates, and conversations scrolled past his eyes. A network of corrupt officers who shared Kex's prejudices. They had created an unofficial system to harass and discourage undesirable species from settling in their sector. Get me a secure line to Alliance headquarters, Tom ordered. This just became a much bigger operation. Meanwhile, in a holding cell designed for metallic life forms, Officer Kex sat alone. His antenna lay flat against his head, all his previous arrogance replaced by fear. Through the energy barrier, he could see other officers being led in for questioning, many of them former friends who had shared his views. Jane Miller walked up to his cell, datapad in hand. "We're interviewing everyone you've stopped in the past year," she said calmly. "Want to know what we've found so far?" Kex turned away, but Jane continued anyway. 3 medical students who left the colony because of harassment. A family of traders who lost their business license on false charges. 24 tourists who were robbed of their credits through fake fines. She paused, letting each word sink in. All non-metallic species. All perfectly legal citizens who came here hoping for a better life. "They didn't belong here," Kex muttered, his translator crackling. "This sector was perfect before the Alliance forced us to accept outsiders." Jane shook her head. "Perfect for whom?" "Your own data shows that crime rates dropped after the colony became more diverse. Business profits increased. Cultural exchanges improved technological development. Everything you claimed to protect actually got better with integration." A commotion at the entrance drew their attention. A group of metallic beings, similar to Kex's species, was being escorted in by security. But instead of the anger or hatred Kex expected to see, they looked at him with disappointment. "Your own people are here to testify against you," Jane explained. "Remember those primitive humans you insulted? Several of them married into metallic families. You've been harassing your own people's loved ones." For the first time, Kex's antenna showed genuine shame. I didn't know." "That's the point," Jane said firmly. "You never tried to know. You just assumed and judged, using your position to make others suffer." Tom appeared at the cell entrance, looking grave. "We've found evidence of similar discrimination rings in 3 other sectors," he announced. "The Alliance Council is launching a full investigation across all colonies." Kex's mechanical body seemed to shrink. "What's going to happen to me?" "That depends," Tom replied. "We're offering deals to officers willing to help expose the full network. More importantly, you'll need to undergo comprehensive rehabilitation and cultural sensitivity training." "And if I refuse?" Kex asked. "Then you'll face the full penalties for civil rights violations under Alliance law," Jane answered. "The same laws you were supposed to uphold." Outside the holding area, more beings continued to arrive, forming long lines to file reports. But something unexpected was happening too. Different species were talking to each other, sharing stories, offering support. The very diversity Kex had fought against was becoming a source of strength for the community. "You know what the real irony is?" Tom said, watching the scene through the security feeds. "Your actions didn't stop progress, they accelerated it. This colony will never be the same after today." For Officer Kex, watching his carefully constructed world of prejudice crumble, those words carried more weight than any prison sentence could. #Justice System. The Galactic Alliance Justice Chamber towered over New Haven Colony's central district, its crystalline walls reflecting the light of the binary stars. Inside the main courtroom, beings from dozens of species filled the observation galleries, all waiting for the most significant civil rights trial in the colony's history. Officer Kex stood in the defendant's area, his metallic form looking smaller than usual under the chamber's bright lights. Around him, 20 other enforcement officers faced similar charges, their antennae drooping with shame as evidence of their crimes appeared on giant holographic displays. The prosecution calls Director Tom Miller to the stand, announced the Chief Justice, a floating being composed of pure energy. Their voice echoed through the chamber's perfect acoustics. Tom walked to the witness platform, his Alliance security uniform pristine. As he took his seat, the platform adjusted to his human physiology, a small but significant sign of the changes already taking place in colonial infrastructure. "Director Miller," the prosecutor began, "please explain how this investigation started." Tom looked directly at Kex as he spoke. 6 months ago, we noticed a pattern. New colonies were reporting unusually high rates of species migration, people leaving shortly after arrival. The numbers didn't make sense, especially in prosperous areas like New Haven. Holographic charts appeared above the courtroom, showing the statistics. We discovered that certain enforcement officers were systematically targeting non-metallic species, particularly humans and other newer Alliance members. They used their authority to make life so difficult that many victims simply gave up and left. In the gallery, Jane sat with a group of former victims who had returned to testify. Many clutched data crystals containing their personal stories of harassment and discrimination. The defendants claimed they were protecting their community's culture. The prosecutor continued, "How do you respond to that?" "Culture doesn't need protection from diversity," Tom replied firmly. "It needs exchange and growth. During our investigation, we found that sectors with the highest diversity rates also showed the greatest technological and economic advancement." One of the defense lawyers stood up, his metallic form similar to Cax's. "But surely you must admit that humans have a history of violence and conflict." A murmur ran through the crowd, but Tom remained calm. "Every species in this chamber has a history of conflict. What matters is learning from that history. Humans joined the alliance precisely because we recognize the value of unity in diversity." The Chief Justice's energy form pulsed with interest. "Director Miller, your wife was instrumental in exposing this conspiracy. Yet records show she was at risk of serious harm. Why take such a chance?" "Because change doesn't happen from a distance," Tom explained. "We needed clear evidence of systemic discrimination. Jane volunteered because she believed that facing prejudice openly was the only way to defeat it." Cax suddenly spoke up, his translator crackling with emotion. "I request permission to address the chamber." After a moment's consultation, the justice panel nodded. Cax stepped forward, his mechanical legs shaking slightly. "I was wrong," he said, his voice carrying across the silent room. "For years, I believed I was maintaining order. But I was really just protecting my own prejudices. The evidence shows that everything I feared about other species was false." The chamber erupted in surprised whispers. It was rare for a metallic being to admit error so publicly. Tom and Jane exchanged knowing looks. This was exactly the kind of breakthrough they had hoped for. "The chamber acknowledges your admission," the Chief Justice declared. "This will be considered during sentencing. Does anyone else wish to make a similar statement?" One by one, other officers stood up. Each confession revealed more details about the discrimination network, but also showed genuine regret and a desire for change. As the session continued, news drones broadcasted the proceedings across the colony. In homes, offices, and public spaces, beings of all species watched together, many seeing their own prejudices reflected in the testimony. The justice system was working not just to punish, but to heal and unite. It was a lesson humanity had learned the hard way on Earth, now helping to shape a more inclusive galaxy. #Cultural Revolution. 1 month after the trials, New Haven Colony looked very different. The once segregated neighborhoods had started to blend together, with species of all types choosing to live side by side. The changes were most visible in the Central Plaza, where a new cultural exchange center stood in place of the old enforcement headquarters. Jane walked through the center's main hall, smiling at the sight of metallic beings and humans working together to set up displays for the upcoming Unity Festival. The walls were covered with holographic art showing the history and achievements of different species, including Earth's journey to the stars. "Mrs. Miller," called out a familiar voice. She turned to see Officer Cax, now stripped of his enforcement rank, helping to arrange seating for the festival. His community service sentence had turned into a genuine passion for bringing people together. "Good morning, Cax," Jane replied warmly. "How are the preparations coming along?" Cax's antenna bobbed enthusiastically. "Better than expected. We've had twice as many volunteers as we hoped for. Even some of my former colleagues are helping." He paused, his metallic features showing what humans had learned to recognize as embarrassment. "It's strange. I used to think mixing species would cause chaos, but look at this." Around them, the evidence of cooperation was everywhere. A group of energy beings was teaching human children how to safely touch their glowing forms. Several metallic youngsters were learning Earth dance moves from a human instructor. In one corner, a mixed-species choir practiced songs in different languages, their voices blending in unexpected harmony. "The media coverage has been incredible," Jane said, checking her datapad. "Our colony is being called a model for cultural integration. 3 other sectors have requested our blueprint for the exchange center." The main doors slid open as Tom entered, accompanied by a delegation of Alliance officials. They had come to evaluate the colony's progress and consider expanding the cultural exchange program across the galaxy. "This is remarkable," one official commented, watching a demonstration where humans taught metallic beings about earth cooking while learning about energy-based food preparation. A month ago, this level of interaction seemed impossible. Tom nodded proudly. Sometimes all people need is a push to step out of their comfort zones. Once they do, they often find their fears were baseless. A small commotion near the entrance drew their attention. A group of metallic children was arguing with their parent, pointing excitedly at a human art class that was about to begin. "Please, create a unit," one child begged. "The humans are teaching about something called finger painting. We want to try." The metallic parent's antenna twitched uncertainly. This was exactly the kind of situation that would have caused tension in the past. But then Kex stepped forward. "I can vouch for the activity," he offered. "We've adapted it for metallic appendages. It's perfectly safe and quite enlightening." His voice carried the weight of his own journey from prejudice to understanding. The parent's antenna relaxed, and the children rushed happily to join the class. Soon, the air was filled with delighted mechanical chirps as they discovered the joy of creating art with their manipulator arms. "You see," Jane said to the Alliance officials, "real change happens one interaction at a time." The officials were taking notes rapidly, clearly impressed. Some were even joining in various activities, their formal demeanor softening as they experienced the natural flow of cultural exchange. As evening approached, the binary stars cast beautiful purple shadows through the center's crystalline windows. The day's activities were winding down, but nobody seemed eager to leave. Different species sat together in small groups, sharing stories and meals, making plans for future meetings. "You know what's truly revolutionary?" Tom remarked to Jane as they watched the scene. "This isn't forced integration or mandatory diversity training. This is people choosing to learn about each other, to grow together." Jane squeezed his hand, remembering the tense traffic stop that had started it all. "Sometimes," she said softly, "the best way to fight prejudice is to let people prove themselves wrong." #New Beginning. 6 months after the Unity Festival, New Haven Colony had become unrecognizable in the best possible way. The once rigid boundaries between species had dissolved, replaced by a vibrant mixing of cultures that made the colony famous across the galaxy. At the new Enforcement Academy, Tom Miller stood before a graduating class unlike any before. Humans, metallic beings, energy forms, and a dozen other species sat together, all wearing the same uniform but each adapted to their unique biology. "Today marks a new chapter," Tom announced to the gathered cadets. "You are the first class to complete our reformed training program. Each of you has learned not just law enforcement, but cultural understanding." In the front row, Kex sat among the training instructors. His rehabilitation had been so successful that he'd been asked to help design the new sensitivity courses. His personal journey from prejudice to acceptance made him the perfect teacher for other officers learning to overcome their biases. "Director Miller," Kex spoke up, his antenna showing pride, "would you like to tell them about the success rates?" Tom smiled and activated a holographic display. In the past 6 months, civilian complaints have dropped by 90%. Tourism has increased by 300%. And most importantly, our colony now has the highest species retention rate in the sector. The statistics floated in the air as proof of their success, but the real evidence was visible through the Academy's windows. The streets below were filled with mixed groups of beings going about their daily lives, no longer separated by fear or prejudice. Jane entered the hall, carrying new data crystals. As the colony's newly appointed cultural integration officer, she had been busy implementing similar programs across other sectors. "I have an announcement," she said, taking the podium. "The Galactic Alliance has officially recognized New Haven's transformation. Our methods will become the standard for all enforcement training across Alliance space." The room erupted in cheers, the sound of different species celebrating together, creating an unusual but beautiful harmony. Even the energy beings pulsed with joy, their glow adding to the festivities. Later that day, Tom and Jane walked through the colony's central market, now a bustling hub of interspecies commerce. They passed a cafe where a metallic family was teaching a human couple their traditional greeting rituals. Nearby, an energy being helped a young metallic child understand how to safely interact with their kind. "Remember when this street was segregated?" Jane asked, stopping at the spot where Kex had once pulled her over. Tom nodded. Hard to believe it was only 7 months ago. Look at it now. The old species scanner checkpoints had been replaced with welcome centers. Instead of checking for unauthorized beings, they provided information about different species' needs and customs. The former detention cells had been converted into cultural museum spaces. At the Cultural Exchange Center, Kex was leading a tour group of new arrivals to the colony. "Welcome to New Haven," he said, his translator conveying genuine warmth. "Here, we don't just accept diversity, we celebrate it." A young human child in the group raised her hand. "But weren't you the officer who used to stop people like me?" The room grew quiet, but Kex's antenna remained high. "Yes, I was. And that's exactly why I'm here today. My story is a reminder that anyone can learn, change, and grow. The real strength of any civilization isn't in keeping others out, it's in coming together." As the sun set, casting the now familiar purple glow over the colony, Tom and Jane watched the evening traffic flow smoothly by. Ground cars mixed with hovercrafts, energy beings floated alongside metallic pedestrians, and nobody gave it a second thought. "You know what the best part is?" Tom said, putting his arm around his wife. "This isn't the end of the story, it's just the beginning." Jane smiled, thinking of all the reports of other colonies starting their own cultural revolutions. "Sometimes," she replied, "the best way to create change is to show people what's possible." Above them, the stars twinkled with promise, each one potentially holding another opportunity for species to learn, grow, and come together in harmony.